Mitigation in ESO is handled in a very different way than you're probably expecting. While most of ESO's mitigation buffs are multiplicative, some of them are handled in a very confusing way. Testing for this was done with SparkRip's calculator. Without this calculator, the video basically would have never gotten made due to the amount of testing that would have had to been done. When I started, I wanted to make sure that his calculator was correct. The way I did this is I started a new character on PTS and had it with no gear and no mitigation. This way I could get a base damage of Olms on Veteran Asylum Sanctorum. I'm using Olms as he's the easiest boss in the game to get to on Veteran, and he gives a very consistent amount of damage. With this, I wanted to take one buff from each section to make sure the calculator was functioning how the game does. Starting off with this character, if we get hit by Olms, we'll take 155,478 damage. We can use this as a baseline for further testing. We now need to take a buff from each section and test to see if the calculator handles the calculations correctly. For the first section, I used Necrotic Potency. With Necrotic Potency, we take 152,023 damage from Olms, and this lines up to what the calculator says. I now moved on to the next section. I used Major and Minor Protection to check this section. With both Major and Minor Protection in-game, we take 132,933 damage. The calculator also confirms this number. The last thing we need to check to make sure this calculator works is how each section interacts with each other. If we take all three buffs we had checked before and add them together, both in-game and in the calculator, we end up taking 129,979 damage. There are a lot of other buffs and they were all checked in roughly the same way. Some buffs were checked with others just to make sure that the order in which buffs were applied was correct. From what I could test in a reasonable amount of time, all buffs are correct and ordered properly. One caveat to this is Disdain, Harm, and Vampirism. I was not able to check these, but with every other buff and debuff being correct, I would assume these are also correct. Before we start going over mitigation, I want to talk about the fact that since U29, every single character made has a default mitigation of 10%. This has been there ever since they reworked the champion point system, and will come into effect a lot more when we talk about the weird ways ZoS multiplication works. For now, we have to divide the damage by 0.9 to counteract the base mitigation buff that we gained in U29. I want to start off with the easy part of mitigation. There are two different multiplicative sections in ESO, one that works how you would feel like it should, and one that will really confuse you if you don't know about it. But for now, we're going to stick with the easy section as all of these buffs are multiplicative with each other. Really, all this means is the buffs are multiplied together, meaning you will also lose value the more and more buffs you apply. Essentially, the way this system works is resistances are calculated first, applying a massive 50% instantly, cutting any damage you take in half. For this example, I want to use my Necromancer that I use in most trials. My Necromancer uses all mitigation CP, these being Hardy, Elemental, Preparation. I also use Major Protection, Minor Protection, Ironclad, Duelist Rebuff, Heavy Armor Bonus, and Max Resistances. The calculation we can use to figure out how much damage we'll take is 155,478 times 0.5 times 0.98 times 0.9 times 0.95 times 0.9 times 0.95 times 0.94 times 0.94. Since the buffs are multiplicative, if we have the same amount of buffs, it doesn't matter which order they are applied in, as they'll always end up with the same value. All of these buffs together, we end up with 68% mitigation and are taking around 49,210 damage. We can now see how much each buff actually decreases damage by when factoring in the total. In this calculation, resistance has decreased the damage by a massive 50%, instantly cutting all of his damage in half. Adding Hardy or Elemental to this, we can see instead of 2% they claim to mitigate, we only get 1% from them, as we only gain 51% mitigation of the total damage. Adding Preparation to this, it says in the tooltip it's 10%, however, doing the entire total, we only get 4.9% because of the massive 50% mitigation from resistances. Our total is now increased to 55.9%. As we continue to add more and more mitigation, it becomes harder and harder to increase our mitigation total. This section is far easier to understand, as it's just multiplying all of the percentages together to give us a total percentage of mitigation and then decreasing the value by that much. When Gold Road was on PTS, it was discovered by SparkRip that you could hit 100% mitigation, showing that many buffs in ESO were additive for some reason. Why ZoS thought additive mitigation was a good idea is beyond me. However, with his discovery, it was quickly fixed and now all of those buffs are now multiplicative. However, during this PTS cycle, it was assumed some funny things were going on as numbers were not lining up and stuff wasn't making much sense. It was assumed that there were hard-coded penalties with certain mitigation combos, however, it was discovered that ZoS was actually doing something even weirder. ZoS rounds certain buffs and always rounds up. This basically makes every single buff tooltip in this next section a complete lie. Alrighty then, it's time for ESO's great system where we do multiplication but then round the number for no actual reason. My current thought process is, because some of these buffs are very large, they don't want to make them too powerful, but however this makes no sense as you could just make them multiplicative and it would probably end up fine. The buffs in this weird section include Gladiator's Tenacity on both Contingency and Torchbearer, Lucent Echoes, Pearlescent Ward, Torque of the Alien King, Esoteric Greaves, Runic Sunder, Major and Minor Evasion, Psijic Deliberation, Necrotic Potency, Disdain Harm, Major and Minor Aegis, Undeath, and the base 10% mitigation all characters have. I want to go over one part of this that will make it far less confusing. When we do math in this section, we have to divide the base damage by an input of 0.9 because we have to cancel out the base mitigation buff as we don't actually know the base damage of attacks in ESO. If we want to check how this section works and see why it breaks mitigation and how you would think it would work, we can use Minor Aegis. Using only Minor Aegis, we would expect to see a 5% mitigation buff from wherever our base damage is. However, if we do the math, this will only end up being a 4.4% mitigation buff. We have to take 0.9 and multiply it by 0.95. We end up with a value of 0.855. This means we end up taking 85.5% of the damage done. However, for some reason, buffs in this section want to round up, so we actually take 86% of the damage. If this section was purely multiplicative, we would expect to see us taking around 147,704 damage. Instead, since we round, we actually end up taking 148,567.8667 damage. If we then do the math to see how much Minor Aegis actually mitigated, it will come out to 4.44%. Minor Aegis is an easy example as it basically is never correct with the tooltip, it is always short slightly. This section heavily relies on when certain buffs are applied, as depending on this we can see massive losses to our mitigation buffs. Some buffs, however, depending on when they are applied, will see no mitigation loss. An example of this is Major Aegis. If we only have Major Aegis, it lines up fine with the base 10%. This is because 0.9 times 0.9 is 0.81, meaning that we don't actually have to do any rounding. To better explain how the order matters, we can look at the two possibilities with Major and Minor Aegis. With this system, if we use Major Aegis first, we end up with 0.9 times 0.9, this being 8.1, and now we do not have to do any rounding. If we then add Minor Aegis to this, we'll have to multiply the new value by 0.95, and we end up with 0.7695. We have to round this up to 0.77. To find the true mitigation, we have to cancel out the original 10%. If we do this, we end up with a mitigation of 14.4%. We end up with 133,020 damage taken. This is extremely close to the multiplicative number due to the fact Major Resolve lost none of its mitigation due to rounding. However, if we do the opposite, we'll end up with a completely different number. Doing the opposite math, we end up with a multiplier of 0.78 mitigation. We lost an entire percentage due to rounding. With this mitigation value, we end up taking 134,747 damage, only being 13.4% mitigation. Switching the order of two buffs ended up losing 1% mitigation for no reason. This was to just show that the order matters, and the order that they do it in does not change, however, in-game. There are so many examples of this, however, going over them would take forever. I want to go over the mitigation penalties now and how they are probably the worst thing in the world, and the tooltip they have are complete lies. There are a couple of forms of mitigation penalties in ESO. One is from light armor, one is from heavy armor, and I'm basically going to be ignoring these as they're really small. However, just like the next one, the tooltips of these penalties are actually lying to you. The big one and the most obvious is the vampire passive to increase flame damage taken. In most situations, you'll have this passive active if you're trying to use the Undeath passive. This means you'll be at stage 3 Vampire more than likely and be taking 13% more flame damage. However, this is a complete lie, and more than likely you'll be taking far more than the 13% flame damage almost all the time. I'm going to continue using Olms' damage as an example, but change it to flame damage for the sake of this video. In this test, I'm going to be using my Necromancer setup from Rockgrove. This setup has full resistances and quite a few buffs. As long as with most buffs in the game, I also have Guard. If we take all of these mitigation buffs and Guard, we end up taking only 19,866.31 damage. This is around 87% mitigation. If we then assume that we are a stage 3 Vampire for the Undeath passive, we actually end up taking 23,453 damage. This is roughly a 15.3% increase over what we were taking. This is because instead of increasing the actual damage you take, the 13% is actually taken straight from your mitigation. This can make the passive's tooltip actively lie to you, as you'll be taking more damage than you think you will be. There really isn't all that much more to say about this other than it's kind of mean to the player, as unless you take the time to learn about this stuff, a lot of the tooltips for mitigation penalties are lying to you. Also, as a player, learning about this can feel rough, as it feels like the game is just against you. I have no real solution to this other than just making you take 13% more damage at the end of your mitigation calculation, but it doesn't seem like they want to do this. As you probably saw from the last section, we ended up using Guard and Spirit Guardian. The funny thing about these buffs is out of all the mitigation ESO besides Major and Minor Maim, these are the only two additive buffs. What makes this funnier from a logical perspective is these are two separate entities adding their mitigation together. In my head, I always thought Guard ate 30% of the damage and whatever was remaining, Spirit Guardian ate 10% of that. Nope, they just add each other's mitigation values and then eat the remaining damage. The funnier part about this is that it actually makes the skills better together, but it just feels weird as they're two separate entities and it just doesn't really make much sense in my brain. Holy crap, this took forever to make, and as of writing this I have no idea how long it will be, but I'm recording this outro first because I want to talk about one thing in this video. I left out Major and Minor Maim from the explanation because I want to make a video covering Major and Minor Maim together with Major and Minor Cowardice. But yeah, mitigation in ESO is a funny little thing, as it has parts that make a lot of sense and then other parts that just make you wonder what ZoS is fully doing. I don't think the system is actually malicious, however ZoS could do with explaining why they chose to do this weird roundabout way of calculating mitigation. Armor penalties are somewhat understandable. I feel like they're a tiny bit harsh to the average player, as if you don't know what they're fully doing, you will take far more damage than you'll expect. But yeah, I mean, I'd love a ZoS explanation to why they thought the additive penalties is a good idea, but that's about all, and I really hope you learned something, and thanks for watching.